Just quickly before we get going, until the Gulf disaster, I thought that the blow-up preventer was a college prank. But this machine, this amazing machine, is 50 feet tall, weighs over 500,000 pounds. That's approximately 227,000 kilograms. It was designed with eight separate and distinct defense mechanisms to prevent a blowout. All 8 defenses failed. All 8 were operated, managed, and maintained by software. Through the due diligence thus to date, more than 62 critical software malfunctions have been attributed to the blow-up preventer. 11 people killed, largest marine oil spill ever, billions of dollars in damage, thousands of lives altered. Not too far from my house here in San Bruno, the PG&E gas line explosion killed 11 people. The Texas City oil refinery explosion, the Fukushima nuclear disaster. Is there anyone that doesn't think that energy infrastructure, extraction, exploration will not have more government and industry regulation? Telcos, transportation, automotive, aerospace, pharmaceuticals, medical devices. These are just a few of the heavily regulated industries today. Agile must and can address these regulatory concerns of these industries. Consider this. Of the total FDA medical device recalls, 79% are attributed to software failures. We have an exciting seminar for you today on how to resolve the challenges of regulatory compliance and audits in an Agile development. I remind you again, the webinar will be recorded for convenience of playback. All presentation materials and recordings will be provided to all attendees. If you have questions during the session, please use the Q&A feature. All attendees will be able to receive a white paper at the end, and I have the honor now of introducing the 2 speakers. The first speaker today will be Tom Grant, Senior Analyst at Forrester Research. Tom's primary focus is application development and delivery plans. He's an expert in productization, agile product management, games, and social media. The second speaker is Tim Strobely. He's from Polarian. Tim will be presenting the Polarian ALM solution and how it works, of course, with an agile development. And with that, I then pass over to Tom.
Okay, so I'll just need to share here. Hope everybody can see my desktop. So far, so good?
Yes, I can see it.
Excellent. All right, so thanks for everybody's patience, too. We'll go a little faster than we'd expected, but we'll want to cover all these bullets. It seems like really a lot of people who have become Agile or are thinking about adopting Agile are very worried about compliance. This is something that was kind of a natural thing to add to our research agenda to really look into it. And as it turns out, it's not as scary as it may seem. It is a set of the very distinct challenges that it poses to development teams that they're not familiar with, but they can fall back on a lot of the strengths of Agile, a lot of the strengths of their own teams, subculture. Collaboration is going to be very important, as we'll talk about. And even there's an argument to be made that compliance can help with agility. That is one of those great counterintuitive discoveries you do when you're a researcher and you're looking at the data and you're interviewing people and you find something you didn't expect. And we'll throw out some words of hope here at the end about how possibly Agile is better for dealing with compliance requirements than waterfall. Okay, so I think this is probably the most familiar part of the presentation today for anybody who's even thought about compliance, and that is kind of the list of scary things that when you're trying to gain velocity, when you're trying to achieve flow in development, a lot of what Agile does seems to disrupt that or weigh it down. So explicitly, the Agile Manifesto said we want to have as little documentation as possible. Compliance puts the demand on teams to produce a whole bunch of documentation, including things that they never even thought of tracking ever before. within that doc set. Verification and validation. On the one hand, Agile teams have a sense of what it means to be done. That is, kind of very economical. You're trying to have good quality, but you're also not trying to kind of go past the point of diminishing marginal returns and quality testing and defect fixing and so forth. On the other hand, many compliance requirements ask for a lot of checking to make sure that you have written the right requirements, and then checking over and over again to make sure that the product as built is what was described in the specs, and everything has been tested to death. Prescribed process. It seems like sometimes compliance standards are telling you how you should be doing your job as a developer versus the self-organizing team component of Agile, which is critical. Letting teams figure out the roles and responsibilities and work according to the patterns of behavior that make this most sense for them. And audits and submissions. Ideally, you'd like to get into this kind of flow of activity, this kind of continuous development, continuous feedback, continuous delivery. What all compliance does is to interrupt that at these key moments for audits and regulatory submissions and say, okay, stop the show. We're going to now deal with the auditors, deal with the regulators. We have to put everything on hold effectively until they're satisfied and we can move on. So here's a set of statistics we've been looking at for the last couple of years. We've been doing some querying of people via some big surveys about their adoption of Agile. And the good news has been, for anybody who has an interest in seeing Agile succeed, that it is definitely a mainstream methodology now. And we've gone far past the point where people are still asking, is Agile going to work? Is this viable? Do you have any success stories to show me? We're well along. If there's a 1 in 3 chance, as these numbers show, that the next team you're going to join will be doing some version of Agile, then we definitely have seen Agile go into the mainstream, and that probability is definitely a mainstream probability of encountering Agile. Now, you look at this and you might wonder, so how many opportunities to be Agile might have been squashed because of compliance? Should these bars up here at the top be larger? But it just, in a lot of regulated environments, there hasn't been the opportunity there for teams to adopt Agile because of the documentation and validation and verification and all the other things we talked about a moment ago. Now, here's the first bit of surprising findings. As it turns out, the darker bar there are the most regulated industries, and the lighter bar is everything else. And if you compare Agile adoption in those two categories, surprisingly, in the most regulated industries, Agile adoption is not significantly lower than it is everywhere else. And if you were to break this out, you could see that it's higher in some very regulated industries than it is in some very unregulated industries like media. So this seems strange on the surface. What could possibly be happening? Somebody's figured out a way around those problems. They figured out to kind of defang the frightening horrors of validation and documentation and so forth. So what did they do exactly? How did they manage to overcome the obstacles? Well, I think before you get into anything specific about Agile in a regulated environment, the bigger question is, what are the regulators really asking for? I think that really what happens often is that teams will misinterpret what compliance means. They'll exaggerate the amount of work involved, or kind of misstate the kind of information that people want. So, first of all, there's the process part. Thou shalt follow a process. You shall prove to us that you've done these series of steps in order to achieve our approval as regulated authorities. Well, very often, and this is particularly true of a lot of the standards around best practices in accounting and transparency into corporations and so forth, what they're really asking for is that you have a process at all, and it's documented enough that someone can validate that the team is following it. That's a lot less scary than this whole notion of a very kind of heavyweight, waterfall-ish process being imposed on people. The documentation. Are you going to be sitting there developing reams and reams and reams of content that never existed before just to satisfy some persnickety regulator? Well, there's some truth to that stereotype, but in a lot of cases, really what you're doing is packaging up information that you already have, and maybe collecting some new information that you haven't been tracking before. But there are automated ways of doing it. There are certainly tools you can adopt in order to generate that information. But ultimately, really, the regulators are looking for something that they can understand in their terms. If you give them a big log file, they're not going to be able to figure it out. But if you can come up with a way to extract from that the information that they're looking for about the frequency with which you've fixed defects during a sprint, or other kinds of statistics they're looking for, who approves the code and code reviews, information like that just has to be added, and it's not necessarily hard to do. Validate. They're really looking for an extra bit of discipline around making sure that when you write requirements, they actually match what people who are using the software would want. That's really kind of the core of validation, is does this fit the realistic business environment, and does it satisfy the personas who are using the technology? And then, and last of all, then during the audit doesn't have to be disruptive. If you've done your homework and you've packaged up this information the right way, and you've collected all the extra information that you needed, you can hand that off to the auditors or regulators, and it can be a much smoother and faster process. The audit doesn't have to be as disruptive as you feared, as long as you do that kind of advance work to prepare. Now, in interviewing people about how they're overcoming these compliance challenges, it seems like the whole concept of Sprint Zero, if you read Ken Schwaber's work on Scrum and kind of know what Sprint Zero means, here it's a sprint that is really kind of dedicated a lot to planning. There's a little more upfront work being done about planning what's happening through the entire release process than you would normally see in that. You just kind of jump in and be working right away versus kind of stepping back in this model and doing more planning initially. You're doing a set of normal sprints, and then as you get through the normal development cycle, kind of near the end, you're going to be focusing the sprints increasingly on quality. That rather than introducing new functionality, you're doing more testing to ensure that you've hit the quality standards that the regulators or auditors are looking for. And then there's this sort of end of the release period where you have done the submission, where the auditors are there and they've asked you a lot of hard questions, they've given you feedback, and you're then doing a series of sprints that are really just responses to what they've said needs to be fixed in the product. Now that model, starting with Sprint Zero with a lot of planning and then going into that kind of end phase of some sort, is actually not unique to compliance. What we found is that this kind of hybrid waterfall and Scrum, because Scrum is by far the most frequently adopted Agile methodology, this water-Scrum-fall hybrid is really the norm. And it's not only because of compliance. There are other reasons why teams adopt this kind of model, but it starts out with kind of a planning period, much like we were showing you a moment ago with Sprint Zero. You have this kind of heavy activity during the kind of the main development, and then at the end there's the release to production or release to manufacturing or some release process then that doesn't that it interrupts the normal Agile flow there at the end. There may be a few extra sprints kind of done here if there are last-minute adjustments to be made, but there is activity being done here at the end, but not in an Agile fashion necessarily, as things are handed over to operations, as things are handed over to people who are releasing the software to the world, et cetera. All right, so this actually is good because that's a kind of a mental model that the regulators come in with. But they when they think about the series of steps that you follow in order to create software, they're generally thinking in terms of waterfall, and they're not beyond education. They're certainly open to learning more about Agile, but it's one of those occasions when you really want to be careful to speak the language that they understand. Here's another kind of common mistake that people who do Agile enough kind of take for granted that everybody understands them. And this isn't just a problem for people outside the company. It's often a problem inside the company. They don't understand really what the Agile team is talking about when they're talking about sprints and continuous integration and other things that define what it means to be Agile. And the kind of one of the critical areas in which to make sure that you're communicating in the right medium is requirements. Now, user stories are great. I have nothing but great things to say about them. I think that they are an unappreciated part of the whole success of Agile. Unfortunately, they're not very good for communicating the information that auditors and regulators want to hear. There's too much that you have to infer into a user story about edge cases and what happens if the operation doesn't work, and expected performance and scalability parameters and other things like that the user story doesn't necessarily describe and may only imply very indirectly. So a lot of teams have now kind of switched to adding another layer on top of the user stories, epics or something else, that does kind of more closely resemble a use case or traditional feature requirements that can then be mapped to the rules that people write. That when you build something, you shall be able to check to make sure that it is fault tolerant and that it performs up to a certain level and so forth. So the other thing, as mentioned before, that you have to be careful about too is making sure that you're actually collecting the information that they want, and that's not always there. So a requirement as a user story that you've validated, you made sure that accurately depicts what people are going to be doing with the software, at some point, kind of then becomes a unit test. It's the basis for doing a unit test definition. Now, the unit test, once it gets run, adds more metadata to it. It may include the defect number. It may include the test number where the defect was identified. It may have the tester ID in that. And for compliance standards, all this information needs to be kind of pulled forward, and new information continues to accumulate. So once you get it in the information of the defect tracking system, you'll add to that a bug number, a prioritization, an owner. That information will get pulled forward into the check-in. That the metadata around the check-in of code will include all that, or at least make it accessible to people so they can trace everything back to the original requirement and back to the original defect when it was found. They'll include the date, the time, who it was checked in, who reviewed the code, etc. And then the build. Which build did it get into? When was the build done? And then you go on kind of back to the beginning here, doing the testing all over again and collecting this information if needed and pulling it through the entire process. This is, by the way, something that ALM tools are very good at doing. It's one of the reasons for having an integrated ALM toolkit is to be able to comfortably generate this information on the fly, and then instead of crashing into the walls of different silos of information with the defect tracking system and the build management system and so forth, this metadata gets pulled forward from one step in the development process to another. Business stakeholder collaboration also turns out to be a big part of the secret for success. The business stakeholders in the company have a lot of information to tell you about what the rules really mean, above and beyond the kind of the formal language, interpreting what the language says, because it is often kind of arcane language, and software developers weren't trained to be lawyers or chemists or hardware engineers. They were trained to be software engineers, and so there's a lot that business stakeholders can do to help you understand what the regulators are really thinking of, what the rules say, and also what the rule is supposed to accomplish. I mean, that there is maybe a user story you write that doesn't capture everything about the business problems that a compliance rule is assigned to address. That if there are barriers to quality in building airplanes, what are those barriers of quality? A software engineer doesn't necessarily know that when you start building software that's going to be ultimately embedded into a navigation system in an airplane. So business stakeholders, collaborating with them turns out to be a big help in dealing with compliance. And collaborating with the auditors. Auditors are people too, and most cases they don't want you to fail, and it's always good to kind of engage them as early as possible. Try to understand if this is the first time through any sort of audit or regulatory submission with them. What are they really asking for? What are going to be the gotchas during the submission period or the audit period that you need to watch? I've been through a couple of these kinds of compliance exercises myself, and these conversations are critical. And again, they're usually pretty open to this and happy to talk to you, and happy sometimes to talk to you about Agile, as I mentioned earlier. I mean, Agile does some pretty impressive things from the standpoint of regulatory officials. It instills a discipline about daily stand-ups and making sure that issues are getting addressed, and continuous integration. You always have to check in something that works, that you don't defer problems until later in the development process. The ethos about refactoring is a good thing from a compliance standpoint. So it's worth taking the opportunity, if it exists, to explain this, because it does kind of increase your capital in their minds. It does impress them that you're capable of doing these things, because these are often exactly what they're looking for. They just may be speaking a different language that's not Agile language. The last kind of best practice I wanted to say is kind of like the big picture here is one in which the team that does well at dealing with compliance and staying Agile really kind of treats compliance as its own product. That making the regulators and auditors happy is a product deliverable. And as with any product deliverable, it starts out with kind of an infrastructure piece. There's a framework of information and process and other things that you have to pull together. And for sake of time, I'm not going to go through that whole list right now. You then build a version 1 out of those components. You give it your best guess, but you know it's going to be wrong to some degree. And this is where kind of the agile value about being open to change is important. Again, because you're going to be going into this expecting to kind of get it wrong. But working with the regulators and auditors, you then kind of now have delivered them something in one piece, not drips and drabs, one big thing that they can evaluate. They tell you what you did wrong. They tell you what you did right. You then build the quote-unquote real version, version 2, which is what they're really looking for. So this is all the documentation, all the process demonstration, all the verification, validation, et cetera. And then expect that in the future things will change. The rules that you were following may be amended. The company may go into a new market and new rules like the one that you were shooting for. Let's say you were dealing with Sarbanes-Oxley in the United States, and now you're dealing with Basel II in Europe. That you're going to be ready then to rev this product to come up with a new release of it as needed for the next go round of a compliance audit or regulatory submission. The last thing I want to say to kind of put all this into perspective is I think the fears really are exaggerated, but it's not the first time necessarily that people in kind of helping Agile be successful, especially in its early history, have maybe exaggerated things a little bit and then kind of quietly overcome the obstacles. So this data shows that you don't have to be a small team in order to be Agile, even though the stereotype very often of Agile is small. And you don't have to be co-located, because most teams are not. Small co-located teams are really the very small minority of development organizations out there. But at one time, people said, oh my God, what are we going to do if we have somebody who's on the other side of the country from where we are? What do we do if we start having hundreds of developers working on the same project? Without getting into the details of what they did figure out ways around that. And so compliance then is just kind of the latest in a series of disciplines that Agilists have had to learn. That, kind of like getting a yellow belt or a green belt in karate, people figured out what practices were necessary to overcome the large team problem, the distributed team problem. Offshoring development, had its own dimension of challenge that it created. And compliance may have a lot of new challenges. They may be pretty tough ones and unfamiliar ones. It may be kind of a black belt level. But people do advance and succeed at achieving that black belt level of agility. And finally, a lot of what you're doing during this push to compliance, as it turns out, are the very things that if you had never thought about compliance at all, you probably would have wanted to do anyway. Automated testing in order to raise the quality of the product is a good thing that a lot of teams want to do. Continuous integration is a big contributor to velocity. Very aggressive defect resolution is another way to quality. Very often, people who are building software in a highly regulated environment are very good at componentizing the different functional pieces of the software, and think a lot about reuse. And reuse is something that is good for a team, whether or not they're interested in compliance. So, in a way, compliance is just kind of giving people a push to do the right thing that they often might not have had. And as we've seen, when people adopt Agile, they're not adopting everything all at once. They may not adopt everything ever. There is a kind of a menu of options that define what it means to be Agile, and maybe you don't do all of them or don't do all of them at once, but if you'd like to do them earlier, actually, as it turns out, compliance provides a very strong reason to do these new Agile practices you haven't adopted yet that much earlier in order to satisfy the regulatory officials originally, but also it's what you wanted to do potentially too.
All right, so thank you, Tom, for this great presentation. And what you described pretty much matches our experience at Polarium. So over the last years, we've helped many customers to improve the way how they do projects, to gain more control over the project data by using Polarium and ALM. But especially in the last 2 years, we've seen many requests related to Scrum or other Agile methodologies, but mainly Scrum was requested. And these projects were very often little test balloons which were embedded in an environment where people still use the waterfall or V-model approach, sometimes just to make sure that they are still compliant. But management evaluated these projects, and for one thing, the feedback was good from development. So developers, they liked doing Scrum, doing Agile projects. But the other interesting thing was that every 2 to 4 weeks, these teams produced something measurable. So management was able to make decisions based on these results. So compared to the old way of working, where they got maybe every 3 to 6 months something, they could react faster. And so they saw the benefits. And it's pretty understandable that now people try to find out if that way of working, that Agile thinking, can be mapped into a broader scope, into an Agile ALM thinking, and even into compliancy. To better understand the challenges here, it makes sense to differentiate between the different types of compliance that you have. So for one thing, there's the process compliance. Process compliance simply means that you document the way how you work, that you work in the way that you have documented it, and that you're actually able to prove that you have worked in that way. So when I go and meet Nick, our Scrum Master, and I ask him, hey, how do you plan your sprints? He should not describe anything different to what we have defined in our process here. And he actually should be able to prove by some project data, by some reports, that he has worked in that way, because maybe he has described just what I wanted to hear. So he needs to prove that. Auditors usually want to see that you have some proof that you have worked in a specific way. In that area, you will also find maturity models like CMMI or SPICE, which do not impose any process. So these models do not say you should do waterfall. They don't say you're not allowed to do Agile or Scrum. But the effort for you is to map these requirements, formulated sometimes as goals, or process practices, to your Agile process. Then we have the tool compliance. Tool compliance is pretty simple. It basically means that the tools that you are using provide the features some regulations requires from you. So, for example, electronic signature or being able to version control your project artifacts, things like that. And then in the end, we have system compliance. And this takes all the requirements that you get when you build a system in a regulated area. So you have norms, standards, guidelines, for example, safety requirements, safety standards. So let's say you build software which is used in the brakes or which controls the brakes of a car. You better make sure that you have covered the requirements of that safety standard. Otherwise, you will not be able to release your product. So let's have a look at these different types of compliance in more detail. Process compliance. In an Agile environment, or if we look at the Agile Manifesto, they value individuals and interactions above processes and tools. If you have to be compliant, the part, process, and tools will become a little bit more important. And so it's important that you manage your project data, your process artifacts. And if we look at the projects nowadays, these artifacts are managed in different containers and different databases, and people or the team needs to manage and port data between these different databases. And it's a lot of effort for them actually to link this information together. Very often they need to maintain links manually between the different systems because they are not integrated at all. And so it's a lot of effort for people to have the traceability they need for compliance and very cumbersome. So at Polarion, you have the great chance that all your process and project artifacts, your project data, is managed in a central place and available for everybody. And depending on the role that you have or what you do in the project, there are different views available. So, for example, a developer, Scrum Master, which work in the project, they usually work on small chunks of information. So a defect, a task, a user story. So a developer just wants to fix this specific defect, or Scrum Master plans that user story to the next sprint. So this is why you can see on the left side a tracker view where people can work and collaborate on the different work items, manage the user stories or the project data and add attributes to them and collaborate on them. Similar, maybe as you know, Twitter, just add comments on them and collaborate on these items. On the other hand, you will have also business analysts, project manager, marketing, which usually use other tools. Usually they are used to work with Office-like environments like Word or Excel. And so Polarion provides just a different view for these people. So they can still work in a document-like environment. So they can create headings, paragraphs, add images, tables, whatever they need. But under the hood, work items, user stories, requirements are created, or they can manually just extract them. And it is all the same whether you edit such an item in a tracker view or in the document view. Everything will be synchronized, and people can collaborate easily on that. And especially regulations or compliance requires you from time to time to produce also documents. Now, let's remember process compliance means that you have a document process, you work in the way as you have documented it, and you prove that you've worked in that way. We don't think that the process description should be isolated on some separate place, not available for people working in the tool. This is why we merge both things together in Polarion. So people usually don't use, when they work with Polarion, they don't have menu bars, complex menus, but they have a page. It's a wiki page which describes the way how your process is managed, so typical process step. And then under this description, you will see the data the user needs to operate on that process. And then you can click on the data, for example, on a requirement to approve it, or there will be a link or a button he can just click to perform the next workflow step. So let's assume he clicks on a requirement that he wants to approve. The standard or the regulation may require you to have a bit more restrictions here maybe because it's a safety critical requirement, so some other people have to approve first or additional checks have to be done. And all these things happen on top of these we call it in Polarion work items, but it's in the end it's project data, where you can define a process on top of these items, and so an approval, for example, can only be done if other people have approved or other roles have approved as well. And in the end, you can prove that you have worked in the way as you have defined it, because Polarion allows you easily to create reports on top of your project and process data. It's similar to mashups. You can just embed charts or tables into your reports and then build a very nice report which may be needed by the auditor, or which helps to prove that you have worked in that way. When it comes to process compliance, there's one additional interesting aspect, and that's change. Because usually processes in an Agile world tend to change more often. So, for example, at Polarion, we developed Polarion with Polarion, and we use Agile processes since the beginning. And we change our process a little every 2 to 3 sprints. That does not mean we change it completely, but there are little changes. And in a compliant, or if you have to be compliant, it's important that you manage these changes and that it's easy to implement these changes also in the tool. Typically, you would manage a process change with a user story. So you would plan that user story in the next sprint, and the result of that process change maybe is a updated process description, is maybe an updated field or a different workflow and an updated report. But this is pretty easy in Polarion because everything is available and easy to be updated. And the good thing here is when it comes to compliance that you can manage it. You don't have to start from scratch, so there are templates available, project templates for different scenarios. So here are just a few. If you want to do Scrum, you can just start with this Scrum project template and then change it to your own needs. Or the same is available, similar is available for XP, but also in controlled environments where you have to be, for example, compliant to, in the medical area, the norm IEC 62304, there's a complete template with all the artifacts and project data you need to produce in such an environment. So as Tom said, you will speak the language of the auditor. So there will be these items available. You can link these items and map your user stories in the end also to these artifacts. Similar is available for risk management templates. So here you can see some screenshots for that area. And also here is a screenshot of the Polarion UI. So you can see no drop-down menus. It's just a little description on top, and then the option for the user to link. I think in this example it's risky system items, and you can link potential harms which are required by the regulation to link these things together. So when it comes to process or to compliance here, very often the challenge for you is to manage your data and the traceability between your project data in a better way. Now, tool compliance. Simply said, you should have the necessary functionality needed by the regulations in your tools. I don't want to bore you with a feature dump here, so I'll give you just some examples. For example, electronic signature. It may be necessary that some actions in the tool or on top of your process artifacts are signed electronically, so that you prove again that you are the person. So, for example, approving a specific requirement may require additional entry of your password, or activity logs. So you should be able to prove who changed what and when. In Polarion, everything is baseline and traceable. This is also true for the configuration, actually. So when you roll back your project to an old state, also the configuration is rolled back, and changes in the configuration are tracked as well. Or, for example, traceability. I mean, that's one of the key things here. If you need to be compliant, I mean, traceability is just key. You need to prove how you covered some requirements down from the high-level requirement to the source code, as Tom also described. So here's an example view where traceability between different artifacts in your project is visualized as a tree. Now, last but not least, system compliance. That's an interesting thing. This is all about the requirements you get when you develop a product in an environment where norms and guidelines come into play, and these guidelines have already requirements that you need to fulfill. So there is a lot of additional requirements suddenly you need to fulfill, and for your Agile project, it means you need to cover them. You need to prove that you have covered these user stories, that you have addressed them, that you have planned them, and that you have tested them. So again here, traceability is very important because the auditor wants to see that you have covered these requirements. Actually, in complex projects, these requirements make up more than half of the requirements. So it's a lot. On the other hand, if we think about how often these requirements really change, there's a big difference. User requirements, they change pretty often. And we all know that at the beginning, our customer does not really know what he wants. He has written something down, and that's the good thing about agility, because you give him something, and he looks at it, and he makes changes. So embrace change. But on these type of requirements, you will not have so many changes. I mean, how often do you think does the FDA or U.S. government or European government change their standards? Probably not every month. And these requirements are also not negotiable. You cannot discuss them. You cannot negotiate about them. I mean, it's just that you have to implement them. You have to prove that you have covered them. So the key here is really prove that you have address these requirements in your process and in your Agile project. So here you can see an example report out of Polarion, where you can see in the first column the user stories, in the second column requirements, which are where the user stories are linked to, and in the third column test cases. But this is flexible, and there are different views that you can use depending on what information or what focus you have on your project data. So here's an example of a traceability matrix. Personally, I think these matrices are only valuable if they are filterable. So this is why you can filter the X and Y axis and define what part of the data you're interested in. And very often these regulations, these standards, they are big. So there are a lot of requirements inside, and it's a lot of effort to manage them in your project. And so we introduced something what our customers really like, and it's called the document library. Better name would be actually requirements library, because these document libraries are there so that you can place all the standards as a central place and then just reuse them by the click on a mouse button in the different projects. And it feels like a copy, but under the hood it's much, much more, because the projects will be notified if the standard is changing, and the projects can manually update and merge the updated standard into their project. So the effort is not so high compared to if you have to do this manually. So in a nutshell, a compliancy does not mean that you have to have a waterfall process. Compliancy does not mean that your process description should be 350 pages big because, for example, CMMI Dev contains 350 pages specification. But compliancy definitely requires you to get more control over your project data, over the relationships between your project data and the process which produces the project data. So a flip chart and post it is not enough. But if you have the right tools in place, like Polarion ALM, you will feel more comfortable when it comes to an audit because you know that all your project data, the relationship, is stored on a central place and well managed, and that you have the reports you need to prove that you have worked in the way as you have defined it. Okay, thank you. So I think now it's time for Q&A session, and I will unmute the participants. Let me just give a minute. So now, are there any questions? I see already some requests to speak, and there was also in the Q&A panel some questions. I see a question here from Maria asking whether requirements are handled differently from source code. I guess this question is to Polarian, so I will answer it. Actually, not really. Under the hood, requirements are checked into a version control system. So we manage all artifacts inside Subversion, and whenever you change a requirement, a new version is created. So that's exactly the same what happens with your source code. The difference is that the source code very often is a result of a requirement, so a commit of a source code will also be linked, maybe to a user story or to a requirement.
Yeah, and that linkage, I would just say, again, is really key. I mean, often what they're looking for is not a lot of new information, but just being able, from any point in the kind of the information space that you have defined for the project, whether you're in a description of a test or a requirement or a build or whatever, to be able to see everything else that needs to be viewed as relevant to it. What are the defects fixed in this build? What are the requirements that are fulfilled in this build? You know, that kind of information is what the auditors are really looking for often. All right.
There is a question related to Agile process, that Agile processes allows requirements being changed at any time, and how the auditor is expecting to see that. Tom, do you want to answer that, or shall I?
Yeah, I'll go ahead. So,
okay.
I think one of the other urban myths about compliance is that it's all about big upfront requirements. That's the only way to do requirements to satisfy people who don't really understand the software development process, and therefore you have to kind of implicitly be creating a requirement set that you don't believe in, because you know that if you do the big upfront requirements, that the significant part of them will be incomplete or just plain wrong. So the kind of the way in which to stay agile while updating the requirements is kind of continuous validation and verification. That as you change things, you both demonstrate that the new requirement has been validated, that you spoke to a person, for example, who is in the role that you're serving, and they understand what you're trying to do, and they say, yes, that's how I would expect the system to behave. And then looking forward into the development process, that then you can trace through things that that change has had the following effects on the code, it's had the following effects on the tests, that all of those kinds of dependencies then are tracked moving ahead, and that any kind of change to the product then is not disruptive in a way that you can't reconstruct what you did because of the change, and therefore every time a change happens, it's going to wind up getting you further and further away from the reality of the actual product versus what it says at the doc set.
There is another question from Steve. If the requirement documents in the document library linked and traced at the individual statement level. So this is, I guess, again related to Polarian functionality, so I'll take it. The answer is yes. So it depends basically what you decide, what part of your document should be a section or something linkable, an object in the end. And so it can be very big or very small. That's just depending on the content, basically, and not in any way on the format of the document. Okay, I think we have time for one more question here.
Can we check this over phone?
Yes, sure.
Hey, this is Thomas Waschkowski from Germany speaking. I have a question about the Polarion toolset. You showed about that the feature the customer do like so much. You are able to map in international quality standards. You've shown 26 to 62, for example, and map this in, keep them up to date. And in your area of the system compliance, you map those quality standard requirements into the process you have used for the project development. Now, my question goes into how deep is this mapping going? Do you have interlinked, for example, a chapter in those standards, example chapter 3, subchapter 1.8, to a dedicated specific activity within the Scrum where these requirements are fulfilled?
No. So it's not directly linked to the Scrum methodology, that template. It is mapped to the standard. So this is still up to the project how this is mapped to user stories.
Okay. Thank you.
And maybe one more last question. There is a question related if the Polarion tool is certified by SPICE, and the answer is no, we are not certified by SPICE, but our customer use Polarion and get certified.
I have a question. My name is Peter Budai, and I'm calling from Sweden. You referred to an investigation, I think 1,000 people, organizations, or projects. I'm not sure what was referenced. Where was that data collected? Was it like a global collection all over the place, all countries, or was it in the U.S.?
Are we talking about the data charts in my presentation?
Mm-hmm. The first presentation.
Yeah, that was U.S., Canada, and Europe.
Okay, thank you.
All right, thank you everyone for attending. And in the chat box, you will see where you can download the white paper. And again, you will receive access to the seminar materials in an email from Polarion. Thank you very much, and have a great day. Bye.